Welcome to UMDF's Ask the Mito Doc monthly webcast. Tonight we will have questions and answers from our wonderful panelists of clinicians, Dr. Amy Goldstein from Children's Hospital of Philadelphia, Dr. Austin Larson from Children's Hospital of Colorado, Dr. Divakar Mithal from Lurie Children's Hospital of Chicago, Dr. Russell Saneda from Seattle Children's Hospital, and Dr. Jennifer Yang from University of California, San Diego, California. Our moderator for the Q&A this evening is our very own Margaret Moore, UMDF Associate Director of Support and Education. Let's get started, Margaret.
Welcome, everyone. We're so happy to have you here at our end of the year Ask the Mito Doc. Thank you all for joining us. I want to get started by thanking our sponsors, Edith L. Trees Charitable Trust and UCB. Just as a reminder, I want everyone to pay attention to social media and this holiday season, give the gift of energy. This year, you'll get to learn a lot about our two Mito kiddos, Gavin and Hayden, and their family. Next slide. Well, let's get started. Ask the Mito Doc, the end of year, wrapping up 2023 with our Mito Docs. Come on screen, doctors, and let's get started. All of our doctors were introduced during the opening, so we will hop right into asking some questions. I'm going to pop into the Q&A and see if there's anything that I want to start with. Okay, I know what I'm going to start with. I would like to start with this question. And this is a question for Dr. Goldstein. Dr. Goldstein, what is the most important blood work that a patient of any age with mitochondrial disease should do each year?
So this might be different depending on who you go visit, but I think a lot of us would do some standard labs. Now, keeping in mind that a lot of mitochondrial patients go to see different providers. So if, for example, you see your PCP and they've just done blood work, we may not be repeating it. But a lot of us would do things like a complete metabolic profile. So that would be things like your electrolytes, your BUN and creatinine to measure your kidney function, liver function studies, glucose. Many of us would do your hemoglobin A1C to check for diabetes. A lot of us would do a complete blood count, again, if it hasn't been done recently by other providers. So making sure there's no anemia or abnormal white blood count, platelets. And then we can also do some metabolic studies. So that includes things that we like to look for mitochondrial dysfunction. So lactate and pyruvate, amino acids, organic acids in urine, acylcarnitine profile. And again, these are things that we look at to see if there's any type of metabolic derangements. And then from there, it depends on what the lab capabilities are or what insurance will allow for. At CHOP, we do a lot of specialty labs because we have a very active in-house laboratory that's run by Dr. Rebecca Ganetsky. So, for example, we do in-house glutathione. We now have something called a ketone body panel that helps us look at complex 1 function. So we may be doing other labs that other people may not be ordering, on the routine. And so that's an idea of some of the labs. Other labs that can be done include things like a cholesterol profile. And again, if you're going to a PCP or a cardiologist, they may be doing labs like that for your general health. And it depends on what other organs might be affected in someone's particular disease. So people who have other endocrine manifestations may need other particular labs. So, really deep dive in thyroid function, adrenal labs, other endocrine function. So some adrenal labs and other cortisol function. Other people might need more particular liver labs, more specific kidney function labs. So it really does depend, and some of the labs might be individual. But that's kind of, some general screening labs that might need to be ordered. That's a great question.
Yeah, a very across the board useful question. I'm going to move on to another that I think has broad interest, and this one I'm going to direct to Dr. Sinedo. The question is supplements. Which one should I take? And are there any new supplements out there? I recently got that question. I thought it was very interesting.
That's a dicey question, only because there are a lot of supplements that have been used over the years. I think we kind of rely some of what we used on the CHOP data. So we tend to use antioxidants of vitamin E, and if there's muscle involvement, N-acetylcysteine. And other than that, it depends if you're deficient in any of the supplements. So for instance, some people are deficient in carnitine, so we would add carnitine. If you have an iron problem, then that becomes a little bit more that we would use more supplements to act as antioxidants because we want to prevent a oxygen radical damage produced by ferroptosis. So in addition to vitamin E, we would make sure that your selenium is at high normal therapeutic values. We may at that point also add coenzyme Q10 to the vitamin E as well. But it depends on the type of mitochondrial disease you have and who you see, because we all have our favorite cocktails. And we don't have any, in particular, we don't have any randomized control studies. Now, if you talk to Mark Tarnoplasky at McMaster, you'll get a whole slew of antioxidants, which he has shown in muscle disease to have some benefit. So he tends to use a lot of lipoic acid as well in his cocktail. But the benefits, we don't have any good outcome data, or at least consistent across the board outcome data. It's just too hard to do that sort of clinical trial. It costs too much money for companies who are basically just supplement companies to run this sort of trial. But whoever you see on this panel and whoever's been on this panel in the past, you'll get their own version of what they think is essential for the mitochondrial cocktail. That doesn't fully answer your question, but I think the waters are murky. And I think, over time, hopefully, we'll get a better feel for what needs to be done because we're fighting two different types of problems. One is the healing problem that Bob Navio has talked about, also the ongoing mitochondrial involvement. So once you have your disease, we're fighting both, and supplements may work for one but not the other, and vice versa, or may work for both. We really need to figure that one out as we go forward.
I have an addendum to that question that came through in the Q&A feature, and this is how it went. Regarding supplements, I read a lot about methylation. Is this important for the general mito public to consider?
Boy, interesting question. We do add folic acid to certain types of mitochondrial diseases routinely, like current SARS or polymerase gamma diseases, because those have been found to have decreased folic acid within the central nervous system space. And we use a drug called leucovorin, which crosses the blood-brain barrier. So in that case, we're supplementing methylation to the central nervous system. If you have a deficiency in a methylating enzyme, then of course we probably would. Austin Larson would probably have a better idea because he works with the guru of that, Johan Van Hu. So he may want to chime in with an answer to that as well.
And you are welcome to chime in, Dr. Larson. We'd appreciate your input.
Yeah, I wouldn't say that we make, methylfolate or folinic acid or other kinds of methylation-related supplements a standard part of the regimen or the recommendations for most patients. Dr. Van Hove's research is around single carbon metabolism, which is kind of a synonym for methylation, but in a different group of disorders. And certainly there is some overlap in terms of the pathways that he's studying, but at least for the time being in our clinic here, it's not generalizable to Mito patients in general.
Thank you. I'm going to move on to my next question. And my next question is actually going to be directed towards you, Dr. Larson, so you can keep yourself on mic. Why do I need genetic testing? I have been diagnosed via muscle biopsy.
So there's a lot of answers to that. Genetic testing helps us to understand the specific mechanism of disease, I would say, is the most concise way to say that. So we know that muscle biopsies can indicate mitochondrial dysfunction in a wide variety of different conditions, and a lot of them aren't primary mitochondrial diseases. So particularly as we move into the era of having a fair number of clinical trials available and really needing to carefully define the mechanisms of mitochondrial disease, genetic testing is the best way that we have to identify not just mitochondrial dysfunction in general, but very specific mechanisms of mitochondrial disease that would allow us to group patients together that have similar mechanisms of disease and might benefit from the same therapy, and also who would be expected to have the same natural history or the same progression of that condition. So then the clinical trial results might be interpretable. So that's one really important reason for genetic testing. I would say, just speaking more broadly as a geneticist, it's very humbling to go back and see patients who had various clinical diagnoses, even clinical diagnoses that seemed really certain at the time, and then to do broad genetic testing and realize that those patients had a completely different condition than we thought they did. So there's a lot of uncertainty. Rare diseases are, it's a difficult area to make really accurate clinical diagnoses because by definition, these are rare diseases, and none of us have seen hundreds of patients with the exact same diagnosis. So we can't really rely on our intuitions in the way that other professionals can, who maybe see, 1,000 patients with MS a year, or 1,000 patients with coronary artery disease, or whatever condition you want to think about. So genetic testing is particularly important in the world of rare disease, where so many of our patients have very different presentations.
Thank you. That's a very complete answer. We appreciate that. I'm going to move to quite a different topic next, and this topic I'm going to direct to Dr. Mito. What are the top 5 things, and I think others might want to chime in on this, top 5 things I should do for overall health if I have a Mito condition? So what should people be doing just to take care of themselves?
That is a really wonderful question. And I think, first of all, I apologize for my hoarse voice. I lost it over the weekend coaching my daughter's basketball team. They don't listen. So the way I'll preface this, instead of giving you an exact top 5, which I will also do that, is to just say that generally speaking, I often find myself counseling people to be healthy. And that sounds really crazy, but the truth of the matter is that for mitochondrial patients, paying really close attention to the things that keep people healthy are very important. And so I'm not totally sure how to rank them. I'm sure all of us have slightly different things that we're biased towards. But I would argue that in the top 5 in some order would include maintaining excellent nutrition, making sure that you have access to, whether it's by mouth or by G-tube or however you're getting fed, really excellent balanced nutrition. There are discussions about what the makeup of the nutrition should be, but I'm talking about at least getting the correct amount of calories and coupling that with really excellent hydration. So I'm not going to call those 2 different things. I'll say that's one thing. Another thing that I think is really critically important is health prevention. So there's a lot of debate as to whether or not vaccines are safe for patients with mitochondrial disease, without touching too much onto what the data is one way or the other. There's not a tremendous amount of evidence to say vaccines are dangerous, but we do know that getting sick, especially from preventable illnesses, is something that can derail mitochondrial patients. So I like for my patients to be up to date with their vaccines as much as possible, in order to try to prevent illnesses that are preventable. Look, kids get sick, adults get sick, everybody gets sick just from being around. But that's one of the ways that I try to encourage health prevention. So that'd be 2. 3, I think, there's a fine balance here for patients that fatigue easily, but overall muscle health. So staying active, engaging in physical therapy as needed, if that's what's needed. For patients that are non-ambulatory, I think therapies are really important to keep the joints from contracting or becoming flexed, and also for bone health, because for patients that are in a wheelchair, something like that, they can get thin bones over time. So physical activity is important, and if that has to be coupled with therapy. I'm going slowly, but I'm trying to be comprehensive. So this is a really tough one. I put it very highly because I'm a pediatric neurologist, but I think sleep is critical. It's not specific to mitochondrial patients, but I've seen that a lot of my patients just really struggle if they're having sleep problems that often can go sort of missed. And those sleep problems can be for a variety of things. There might be an actual sleep disorder that needs to be diagnosed, but even before you get to that, just having good sleep hygiene, going to bed around the same time, waking up around the same time, getting age appropriate amount of sleep for younger children. That's more than people realize. Even up to the age of 8 or 9, 10 years old, you should be getting 10, 11 hours of sleep. And that's really hard to do with schools and things like that. So sleep hygiene is important. I think for mitochondrial patients, it can contribute to fatigue in ways that we don't really clearly state. And the last one is debatable, I would say, but I would avoid unnecessary medical interventions and procedures. That's a tough thing to say, but I think there's a desire to pursue things that may help, but there is often a cost associated with those things. And so not knowing what you're putting in your body, whether it's something that doesn't have any evidence to support it, or something that's not FDA approved, or going through a procedure that doesn't have evidence to support a true benefit, if it includes something like anesthesia, there's non-zero risks for these things. So it's a big category, but generally speaking, I try to avoid doing things that are not proven to be generally safe and are not proven to be beneficial as well. So my 5 things would be nutrition. I'm not going to be able to do an order again, but nutrition, which includes hydration. Did you write them down? Did somebody write them down? Nutrition, which includes hydration, sleep, physical activity, like avoiding unnecessary medical things. And what was the 5th one? There was a 5th one. I can't remember what I said now.
I thought I had 5 fingers, so I
did say something else. I'm forgetting what my
I know
second
there
one
were
was.
5. But thank you for that very complete answer. And I think it's important for everyone to think about just some of the things that are across the board for most people. Sometimes we don't focus on those, and I think it's important that everybody does. So thank you for that very complete answer. The next question I have has two parts, and I'm really going to field this to the whole group because I think it's important. What is the best path forward for those that have been unable to get a diagnosis with a genetic test? And then part two, is there anything new coming in the genetic testing world that might help these folks? I'm going to let Dr. Goldstein's face looks like it wants to answer this question. So I'm going to ask her first, and then all of you, I would like for you to chime in.
Okay, sorry, I was unmuting. And Margaret, can you please repeat the question? Because I was typing into the chat at the same time, multitasking.
Okay, what is the best path forward for those that have been unable, and basically what should you do if you are unable to get a diagnosis with a genetic test?
Yeah, so it really depends on what genetic test we're talking about, right? So there are a lot of genetic tests that are still available out there. And so the first thing that we need to do is assess what genetic test was done. Some of the patients that come to us have had a genetic test that includes a chromosomal microarray or a panel-based test, right? They've had a mitochondrial panel, which doesn't include the most comprehensive genetic testing available yet to date. So we first have to see what's been done. Some of our patients have had whole exome sequencing that maybe didn't include mitochondrial DNA sequencing. So we have to fill in what has been done, what hasn't been done yet. For some patients, whole genome sequencing might be the next appropriate step. For some patients, and not all, muscle biopsy may be the next appropriate step. Right. And so for some patients, we just have to decide what might be the next appropriate step. For some patients, we may have a suspicion about what their diagnosis may be, that another genetic test might be more appropriate. So in other words, if they've had whole exome sequencing, whole genome might be appropriate, but there are, in fact, other genetic tests that might be more appropriate for what we might consider their diagnosis to be. So we really have to think about it, and that might be a team approach. There are still centers that have an undiagnosed disease network. And so for some patients that remain undiagnosed, the next best step may be referring to an undiagnosed disease program or network. That may be at that center, it may be at another center, or back to something like the NIH. And so we always have to keep in mind what programs are still open. Sometimes different programs at different centers don't have funding to accept new patients for that fiscal year. And so we're always kind of keeping in mind what's available, who's accepting patients, who's not accepting patients, and really try to figure out what are the next best steps. What's really wonderful about some of these programs, such as undiagnosed disease centers, is that for some patients, we want to keep pursuing testing, and let's say insurance just won't allow it. They won't allow the next steps, or sometimes what we encounter is we've actually recommended muscle biopsy, but there's parts of the muscle biopsy that insurance actually won't pay for. And that's why we did the muscle biopsy. And so we'll then partner with an undiagnosed disease program, and that program will actually help pay for certain parts of the muscle biopsy, or they'll cover the whole genome sequencing that insurance wouldn't cover. And so we partner with that program when we get those next tests covered, and then we pursue the next round of testing together with that undiagnosed disease program. At least that's how we've put things together at CHOP. I don't know what other centers do, but we keep pursuing it, because being undiagnosed, especially when all the doctors that are involved in that patient's care are saying, this has to be genetic, there's nothing else going on here. That's why we want to keep pursuing it. And then for other patients, sometimes what we have to do is we say, we're doing the best we can with symptom management, and it may just take a couple of years until we discover that gene. And, I've been at this now for a few decades, and I know I have patients that I took care of 10, 15 years ago, and we finally have a diagnosis now. And it just took a while. It took 8, 10 years sometimes to find that gene. And I know it's a really long time to wait for a diagnosis, but it's so satisfying when we finally get there. So for some of the families, we just have to say, hang in there, we're going to get there. We just have to wait for science to catch up with us. And at the same time, we just make sure we're covering all the bases. We're treating what we can treat by making sure the symptoms are well covered.
I think the gene testing space is still evolving. I know that we are trying to do gene sequencing using long read PCR instead of short read exome sequencing. But for those of us who are in that space, there are certain genes that you can't get a good sequence from using long reads. And so you actually have to use short reads, like the histocompatibility genes. You have to use short reads to get a good sequence on those. And so using long reads and short reads becomes very expensive. And if you're lucky enough to have an insurance that would pay for certain companies that do both, I think then you would be one up on things. But like Amy was saying, we don't know all the genes for mitochondrial disease. And there's certain sequences that on one, if you only do short reads, you would miss, like a 2 base pair insertion or something like that. So I think as the sequencing gets better, I think at least we'll have feel more comfortable with saying, well, so far you don't really have a mitochondrial disease, or we're just waiting for science to catch up with your son or your daughter or yourself. And I know that's so unsatisfactory because we want to give you a diagnosis. I mean, that's why we go through all the hoops that we go through. So as much as you're frustrated, I think everybody on this panel can feel as frustrated at times as well. So it's an evolving science, and you know, we run the little the gauntlet of the treadmill as fast as we can, but hopefully one of these days we'll get to a spot where we'll feel comfortable in doing what we do and make it more streamlined and more cost effective.
Yeah, and I'll just add to that you know, there are a lot of people with really frustrating symptoms for whom we don't identify a monogenic or Mendelian genetic cause. So that's the scenario where we're looking for a single gene, and that one gene, a change in that one gene is responsible for all of the symptoms that a patient has. So that's kind of our paradigm, right? We're rare disease geneticists or neurogeneticists. That's the type of diseases that we're looking for. But some people have symptoms that don't have that mechanism. So some people have symptoms that result from multiple causes, both things that are intrinsic and extrinsic. There may never be a concise diagnosis or a simple answer to account for the symptoms that some people have. As Dr. Goldstein and Dr. Senato said, that doesn't stop us from looking and applying better testing as years go by. But I also don't want to have unrealistic expectations that every single person is going to have a single gene identified that is the basis of their symptoms.
Thank you all for that. The next question, this is a more general question. I know you answered a more specific one earlier. I'm going to direct this to Dr. Larson, but I would love for everyone to pipe in on this. And I wrote this question because I know I've been getting a lot of questions about this from a variety of people for a variety of reasons. Okay, I want you to explain what is expanded access or compassionate use in with drugs that are in clinical trial, and how do I get it? This is a question I get across the board from parents of children and from affected adults, and I think that we need some education on exactly what those words mean and what steps a person would take if they were interested in entering one of those programs.
Yeah, so when we talk about expanded access or compassionate use, we are talking about two different things. So there are formal expanded access and compassionate use programs that have pre-specified protocols. The FDA has approved them, and they run similarly to clinical trials, but generally are much less resource intensive. So they have fewer, often fewer lab draws or outcome metrics that are studied. And those types of programs generally exist for drugs in development, but either for patient populations that don't qualify for an existing clinical trial, or if a company is developing a drug, but they're between phases of a clinical trial, or they're planning a trial in the future for a different indication, they may create one of those kind of formal or more structured compassionate use programs. There's also a scenario where an individual clinician can say, there is such a compelling use for this drug that is not approved for this one patient. We understand the mechanism of their disease really well. We understand the mechanism of the drug. This is just, this is just too compelling. The risk-benefit ratio is such that this is a scenario that justifies, even without an existing protocol, using this drug in this one case. So those are kind of two separate things. In both cases, there has to be a company that is supportive of either providing just the drug or potentially providing the drug as well as some additional infrastructure that's needed around that in order to both provide the treatment and also monitor it somehow. If the company is just providing the drug but not providing the rest of the infrastructure, then that really falls on an individual clinician to figure out a way to identify those resources at their institution, and to be able to support that. It's really resource intensive, both for companies, for individual clinicians. That process doesn't scale up to all of the patients that we care for. So there is going to be limited bandwidth for those types of programs. And I know that can be frustrating, but that's kind of the reality. Does anyone else want to weigh in on expanded access or compassionate use?
I was going to add, because this came up for a patient recently, they also don't indefinitely grant either continued access or multiple patients for an unapproved or an unstudied medication. So it's not a good sustainable way for treatment, which is why it's so important, if we have a promising treatment, to really try to move it into the realm of clinical trial, to have it looked at rigorously. So that's what I was going to add.
And so there are other avenues depending upon the investigator. We have a good drug that works for mTOR mutations in the intractable epilepsy space. And we wrote a phase 1 study that was FDA approved, and we found that it's working. But the company has decided they don't want to give us drug anymore. So we're trying to revise that study to be used as a open label compassionate use study, but we're having trouble getting funding. And so sometimes a drug may work and you may have good results, but you can't get the drug, or the company's not going to support the drug or support everything else that goes along with using the drug. And I think that's one of the hurdles that we have to figure out in the open compassionate use care-based studies.
Thank you all. I'm going to switch gears a little bit, and then we're going to come back to clinical trials in a minute. And this question I'm going to direct to, do I have this for Dr. Yang? What doctor should be on my care team? This is a question that I get quite often, and people get confused on like who should be the lead, who should be the sort of person that's the center of the wheel for all the referrals that go out there. But who do you think are the most important players on a care team for a patient with a mitochondrial disease?
Yeah, so really good question. I think I could probably speak for the rest of the panelists that we end up kind of being the main lead for our care for our patients. Depending on the academic center, if there is a mitochondrial specialist, they either come from the genetic space or the neurology space. And in some centers, we may have both. And so either or, ideally both a geneticist and a neurologist. Most mitochondrial diseases have some sort of neurological manifestation. We all routinely do regular cardiac monitoring. I think if it's normal, you could wait. If depending on the mitochondrial disease you have, if there's high risk for cardiac dysfunction, then certainly having a cardiologist is very helpful. I think this question came up earlier even within the neurology space. If it's a young child, if they have a lot of neurodevelopmental abnormalities, sometimes in those cases, I've also called in some of my colleagues who have specific neurodevelopmental specialty to kind of help out with these cases. And then it depends on the type of mitochondrial disease, like I said. So if you have something like LHON, you certainly need a neuro-ophthalmologist or at least an ophthalmologist. I think those are probably, and then, if you have diabetes, certainly endocrinologist. So it does depend on what the predominant symptoms that you have as well.
Thank you very much. I am going to move on to, and I think I'm going to direct this question to Dr. Goldstein, but I'd love for the rest of you to offer some input on this. What about telehealth? Can I see an out-of-state doctor virtually? Why or why not? And what has changed in that space and what has remained the same, and kind of where are we in terms of telehealth?
Yeah, it's a great question. So, because of COVID, a lot of us who were never able to do telehealth before were suddenly allowed to do telehealth. And so I think it is, one of the biggest benefits that came out of COVID was suddenly this ability. And this was not because we didn't want to do telehealth, but because insurance companies did not allow it. And so because COVID was considered an emergency and we wanted people to continue to get medical care, there were factors that were put into place that allowed this to happen, right? All of a sudden, insurances were allowed to cross state lines, and this was an emergency. So it was allowable for at least a year or two, and then things changed, right? The emergency was over, and then things started kind of getting back to quote unquote normal, and we were no longer allowed to see anyone who we wanted to, depending on what state they lived in. And what we then started doing for me to continue to be able to see people virtually was I started collecting different licenses in different states. And so what I had to do from where I sit in Pennsylvania is the hospital assessed how many people did I see from certain states and what licenses would they let me obtain. So I now have a license in Florida, I have a license in New Jersey, and I have a license in Virginia. And I am allowed to now see those patients who live in those states via telemedicine. I'm trying to get a license in Georgia. I'm trying to get a license in New York, but those happen to be very expensive licenses. And I think that my hospital is going to put the kibosh on obtaining further licenses. And so, again, I think telehealth is a wonderful, wonderful thing because a lot of patients can't travel. A lot of what I do can be done via telemedicine, especially if my patients are able to see other providers in person. Where my biggest fear is I'm not laying hands on somebody. So if they have something that I can't diagnose because I'm not listening to the heart, or making sure that there's not another problem on physical exam, I'm not able to examine them. But if they're at least seeing one other provider who can detect those problems, then I feel better. If they can go somewhere more local or have somebody come to the home to do critical labs and things like that, again, I'm not going to worry about that part of it. But if I'm able to have a discussion and we're able to continue to provide care via telemedicine, then, you know, that's my biggest concern, is to make sure that we're continuing care. Especially if travel to see me is not possible. I'd much rather do telemedicine than have somebody miss visits for 2-3 years in a row. So I think there's pros and cons to telemedicine, but I think that it's been a wonderful, wonderful way to continue care for somebody who otherwise wouldn't be able to come in person to see me.
Any other comments on the topic of telehealth? All right, we're going to move on to a couple of big questions. And I think I'm going to divide this question into 2 parts because I think it may need to be divided, and I want to hear from everyone. The question is, what clinical trials are out there? And let's talk about pediatric ones and then clinical trials for adults. And I guess I will allow whoever wants to speak up first to start. What's out there for our patients and families right now?
I can start. So I know that there is a stealth trial that is ongoing. I think recruitment has just ended, but this is the last of the Empower trial for patients with replosome defects. So that's POLG, Twinkle, similar genes. So nuclear gene defects for adults. And this is following the last trial that did not meet its endpoints, but hopefully this one will. So what we learned from the last trial that did not meet its endpoints is that in January of 2020, when the last trial did not meet its endpoints, we had everyone send back their drug, and this included people that were in an open label compassionate use extension who had to send back their drugs. And what happened was people started saying, hold on, I'm now 3 months without my drug. Something's happening. My balance is worse. This is worse. That's worse. And we learned a lesson. There were some people that were responding to drug, and the company said, we have to design a whole new trial. The people who are experiencing worsening, let's get them back into a randomized control trial. So that trial we have, I know I have a few patients that are still on that trial. And in fact, some of them are about to come off of randomization and go into the open label extension. And we're anticipating that trial to finish sometime within the next year, and then hopefully have data. And fingers crossed, if the data look good, we may have an FDA approval sometime in the next year for the Ellamiprotide drug. And at the same time, that is one of the drugs that several of us have a compassionate use expanded access program for. That's going on at the same time for anybody who is not eligible to be in the randomized control trial. So that's one trial that's going on. At the same time, this one again is also no longer open, but the RENEO trial has closed to enrollment, and the data are being looked at by the FDA, and we may have an answer in the first quarter of 2024 for RENEO. If we don't have statistical significance, they may open another trial for enrollment for RENEO. The Astellas trial had been enrolling and is now currently on hold for enrollment, pending a review, and there may be more information coming on that one. And those two are also for adults only. We just had the Bench to Bedside UMDF call on Monday, and what was very exciting is hearing all of the trials that are kind of up and coming, several European trials that hopefully will be coming to the US soon. I know that Elhan has a few gene site trials. I think 11778 and 3460 had either have or are having some small trials that are ongoing for gene therapy for Elhan. And those are the ones that I'm aware of. I know that several of us have a few irons in the fire, hopefully some that will be enrolling soon. But it's been a time where we're, again, kind of gathering IRBs, getting approvals, hopefully having some more movement. I feel like I'm forgetting something. I don't know if anyone's aware of any other clinical trials that are about to launch that have other information of trials that are happening.
Well, the DCA trial, Amy, is closed,
Yes, thank you.
but they're crunching all
Yeah.
the data to go before the FDA, and they're hoping for an answer early first quarter 2024.
Yes, thank
Novia has opened up their trial for Pearson/KSS patients, but you got to go to Israel, which
Well, it's on hold because of the war. Natalie was call on Monday, and the Ministry of Health of Israel did approve them to start enrolling again as of August. But of course, after October 7th, it is on hold.
Yeah.
So we'll see what happens. But the good news is they are going to open again.
Yeah.
But yes, thank you for the reminder about DCA. So they are looking at the data, and then they may be offering DCA again for PDH patients, I believe, sometime next year, because it's closed for enrollment as far as the trial goes for the time being. The one other thing I don't know about for Barth syndrome, which is a very individual mitochondrial disease, they finished the phase 2/3 trial last year. That paper was published. They didn't meet their primary endpoints, but the secondary endpoints look very promising. But the FDA did not look at the data. And this is using elimipritide, again, the stealth drug, once again, for Barth syndrome. And now there are over 100 patients on open label extension, compassionate use for Barth. And we are asking the FDA to just look at the data. And again, I think Jennifer made a point earlier. We can't just have people on open label extension forever. At some point, we have to get the FDA to look at the data, approve the drug, because otherwise these drug companies at some point are going to decide they can't afford to keep providing drug for free, and we have patients at risk for losing drug that could be helping them. And so it really puts us in a precarious position. And when we go to DC and start lobbying for things, this is, I think, one of the biggest things we have to lobby for. The FDA has to look at data to be able to provide approval for these drugs. They can't just leave us in limbo forever, because we really are taking a big risk of having people lose access to their medications.
I wanted to direct everyone's attention real quickly to the chat feature. Dr. Goldstein mentioned Bench to Bedside, and Bench to Bedside is our sort of clinical Ask the Mito Doc that happens each month for our scientific and medical community. We did open this month up to our patient and families, and the link is there for you to view the recording. I encourage everyone to do it. It runs through every clinical trial that's happening. There were 10. And I think it's a great way to get all that information in one spot. And you might have to listen to it twice, because there's a lot of information in a very short bit of time. So I see that we have about 10 minutes left. I'm going to field one more question about clinical trials, and then I have a question for everyone on the panel. So my other question is about gene therapy. What is it? When will we get it? What are the roadblocks to having it? And what can patients expect about gene therapy?
I'm happy to start.
Thank you.
So the first thing to say about gene therapy is that there is an FDA-approved gene therapy for a non-mitochondrial disorder. And that's exciting. That means that we're moving into an era where we can deliver a gene to a human being and fix a genetic deficiency. That promise from spinal muscular atrophy is a game changer in a lot of ways. I mean, it's a brand new way of treating disease, and it's been incredibly successful for spinal muscular atrophy. So I think we should start with accepting that there is new hope. Specifically for mitochondrial disease, the problem is much more complicated. And let me start by saying what I mean by gene therapy. So generally speaking, gene therapy refers to the delivery of a gene that is not currently part of the human being who you're giving it to. That gene will get taken up by the cells of that human being and begin to get expressed, theoretically replacing some genetic deficiency. So What that means is you need to know what the genetic deficiency is first. So you need a diagnosis. And then you need to have some way of delivering that gene to the human being in a way that will allow it to get expressed in the cells where it has to get expressed, go to the mitochondria. In our case, we're interested in mitochondria, and fix the problem in the mitochondria. As of right now, there are no gene therapies for mitochondrial disease. There are a number of different groups around the country who are interested in developing gene therapies for specific genetic disorders. So not like a one gene therapy for all mitochondrial diseases, but a gene therapy for a specific mitochondrial disease. The hope is that as more gene therapies come online for all different diseases, we'll have ways of developing them more quickly and more safely. Right now, there are none for mitochondrial disease. There's potential for any genetic disorder potentially to be addressed. Additionally, there are other types of gene therapies that don't just replace the gene that's abnormal. There's some that boost some other biological function. There's some that bypass the problem that you have. There's a lot of potential down the road. But at its most basic level, the way I'd like most people on this call to think of gene therapy is that if you have a specific gene diagnosis, the most likely gene therapy that would come online is a replacement for the deficient gene that you have. Now, before I go any further and I let other people talk, I'll say that there's quite a few barriers to entry into this. The first one is that somebody has to make the gene therapy. That is a not insignificant undertaking. There are some avenues to that. There are rare disease programs. There are startups out there that are interested in partnering with families and making treatments even for one child. But it's a challenge to get into those things and takes quite a bit of effort. I'll address the sickle cell thing in a second as well. The second thing is that once you have a therapy, the safety of it is hard to assess, especially if you're giving it to one person. And so safety is a big problem, and we got to be really careful about that, because the first thing all of us doctors say is do no harm. Everyone says, well, if you can do anything for my child, you should do it. But these therapies are brand new. They have a lot of effects that can do it. And the third thing is the rate at which things are changing. There may be new things that come up that are very helpful. So people have probably heard of CRISPR. They've probably heard of other things that are happening in other genetic disorders, like for Duchenne muscular dystrophy, there's something called exon skipping that they're doing. And I just want to say that with all the technologies that are out there, it's easy to get one's hopes up. It's easy to see this and say, well, somebody should be applying this to mitochondrial disease. But I think it is worth a conversation with your treating physician to identify whether or not yours or your child's or your family member's specific genetic disorder is somewhere on the map of being treated. And if so, how far along is it? And if not, and if you're very motivated, to start partnering with some people who might be able to help you build a targeted therapy for yourself, with the understanding that it's not, we're not quite at the phase where this is a flip the switch and make something happen. Somebody mentioned in the chat that a company cured sickle cell with gene therapy, and I want to be really cautious about that. Sickle cell treatments have advanced dramatically. Like, there's no question about that. And there's a lot of great things happening in the sickle cell space. Those treatments require a stem cell transplant. They require the person's bone marrow being replaced. It is a gene therapy, but they fix the cells outside the body, and then you go through a whole stem cell transplant. That's not exactly what we can do right now for mitochondrial patients, because for sickle cell, it's really their blood cells. If you replace their bone marrow, their blood can be potentially better. But for mitochondrial disease patients, we're talking about brain cells, heart cells, liver cells. Doing a bone marrow transplant isn't going to replace all of those tissues. So while, yes, there's been some major advancements in sickle cell, it's quite different than spinal muscular atrophy, where they actually gave a gene that the brain cells are now have taken up that gene and are using it to produce healthy protein. So that's really what our hope is that we can give genes that cells will take up and make a healthy protein that's not being made, but we're still a ways away from being able to give that.
And I also think there's a concern about when you give gene therapy. For spinal muscular atrophy, if you wait too long, anterior horn cells are already dead and they're not going to regrow. So you're not going to do much for that patient with this SMA. You may help it a little bit, but unless you can regrow anterior horn cells, which you really can't, you're not going to fully correct that disease. We gave Zolgensma to 2 children 3.5 years ago on an IND, and they were a little bit far along. It really, really helped both children, but they're both still impaired. And currently they're undergoing small molecule treatment to help them progress a little bit more. But they had already lost a lot of anterior horn cells. And so we can't make those regrow. And so in mitochondrial disease, we're fighting the big brick wall of we don't diagnose until something goes really, really wrong in your disease. And then we say, oh, well, you got a mitochondrial disease because you've got this, but the horse is already out, or at least the horse has already opened the barn door. And now we're trying to fight not only the disease, but the healing process, that the healing process causes more problems. That's just part of mitochondrial disease. So we've got to learn to diagnose these disorders earlier. We've got to be more perspective in how we try to figure out what they are, what's causing them. And then gene therapy will go a lot further. That's not to say that you shouldn't give gene therapy for Leber hereditary optic neuropathy, for sure. But I mean, we just need to be on top of things and diagnose things earlier as well.
Thank you
I
all
was
so very
gonna
much.
add-
Oh, go ahead.
Oh, I just want to add a note about the LHON one though, because that one is challenging because you have rapid vision loss, and so not all of those patients who got who got the gene therapy, had visual recovery. And so, you know, along with trying to develop better treatment to target the genetic causes of these disorders, we still need to do a lot of work in finding out, you know, if there's a problem with the gene, there are lots of steps after the gene in terms of protein translation and how it affects the body that needs a lot of research on what the consequences of those genetic changes are. So yeah, so TBD on the LHON story too.
Well, thank you all for that. I have one last question that I want to field to each of you. We're going to do kind of a quick round the horn with this. Here's the question. I've used this question in a variety of forms in some of my support groups, and it made me think about how I wanted to use it here. So looking back at 2023, what do you think was the most positive development in the Mito world? And what are your hopes for 2024? So a look back at the last 12 months, what was exciting and what happened that was exciting during that time, and what are you most excited for next year? And I'm going to start with Dr. Larson because he's in that top corner of the Brady Bunch.
Well, I would like to give credit to Dr. Goldstein and her colleagues in terms of thinking about phenotyping mitochondrial disease in a really broad and kind of nuanced and sophisticated way. And, you know, I think that we have had this kind of a little bit of a historical accident of calling something mitochondrial myopathy that is really a complex multifactorial process with a lot of contributors to fatigue and exercise intolerance and decreased function. And that naming it, I think, has caused some problems in terms of how we think about outcomes for clinical trials. So Dr. Goldstein and her colleagues are starting to do the really hard work of defining if it's not a pure myopathy, what is it? What are the other measurable things that are contributing to decreases in function and fatigue and the symptoms that our patients have? And I'm optimistic that hard work will kind of pay it forward in terms of having more sensitive and more appropriate outcome measures to see what mitochondrial treatments are working.
Thank you so much. And Dr. Goldstein, best thing from 2023, and what are you looking forward to in 2024?
Yeah, thank you for that, Austin. One of the things that I get very excited about at my job is, not only just seeing all of the patients that I'm able to see. I get to see patients with mitochondrial disease every day. And I say that because I had been working as a general child neurologist, wanting to be able to see patients with mitochondrial disease. And I felt lucky when I could see somebody with mitochondrial disease once a week or once a month. And now it's what I get to do every single day. And we're trying very hard to improve the lives of people with mitochondrial disease, but also improve the status of the clinical trials. And when you see that, there have been so many clinical trials that have been done and we still don't have a drug, it's not because these drugs don't work. It's because, we need to improve how we do the clinical trials. Friedreich's ataxia now has a drug that works. We used that drug for a trial with mitochondrial myopathy. Maybe it doesn't improve a 6-minute walk test, but maybe it does, just like Friedreich's ataxia. Maybe it improves mitochondrial ataxia. And maybe we just didn't pick the right outcome measure, right? And so I think it's great to be at a center where we are improving the outcome measures. We're getting very savvy about what kind of scores we use and, making compound outcome measures and really trying to perfect how we think about outcomes and what are the symptoms that our patients have. And again, not that I want anyone suffering from this condition, but I'm benefiting from being able to see this many patients and putting patterns together and then reaching out to Austin and Devakar and Russ and saying, hey, I've just seen a patient with this. Do you have anybody? Let's see how these patients are similar, see how they're different, publish new papers, get the phenotype more clearly defined. Let's figure this out. Calling Jennifer and saying, hey, I have an idea for putting a pathway together. What are you doing over there in California, right? And just comparing notes, right? So it's really been great. What gives me hope for next year is, the call on Monday, my head was spinning. 10 drug companies within an hour talking about clinical trials. We have our hands full, right? We have parents that want to talk about, how many different clinical trials is my kid eligible for and what can we do moving forward. We're moving into new territory. And it's very, very exciting. We've been dreaming for this moment when we can put people on medications and enter them into drug trials. And it's very, very tangible at this point in time. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Dr. Goldstein. Dr. Mito.
Well, it's hard to, I don't want to overhype any one finding. I'm a basic scientist and I get excited about scientific findings. I think there's a lot of really exciting stuff happening with regard to mitochondria. I think I will say that the most exciting thing for me actually happened towards the end of 2022, which is that we were talking about CRISPR earlier. There's a way to CRISPR edit the mitochondrial genome now. And that's a really challenging thing to do. And the people that are working on it did an incredible job of making this work, take advantage of all the advances in CRISPR and moving them more towards mitochondrial genome. It is, I hope I can say this in the context of my prior answer, it is still a long ways off from impacting. So the thing I'm actually looking forward to in 2024 has nothing to do with that. The thing I'm looking forward to in 2024 is that this past year at the Child Neurology Society, where Dr. Goldstein, Dr. Sinetto, myself, we were there. Mitochondrial disease was the presidential symposium there. So all child neurologists across the world who came to this massive conference for us got to see Dr. Goldstein and Dr. Sinetto talk about mitochondrial disease and share their expertise. It is renewed, it has a renewed focus. There's, I think, Jennifer, I don't want to speak for you, but you're relatively new out of training. I'm relatively new out of training. I feel like there's a lot of us who really want to be a big part of this. And there's just a lot of momentum, I think, at the educational level, at the junior faculty level, And obviously, with the wisdom and expertise that's out there, all of us keep getting together and doing stuff. So I'm really looking forward to that momentum carrying forward in 2024.
Thank you so very much, Dr. Mithal. Dr. Yang.
Hard to follow up those acts, but I'll tag on to what everyone was saying. I do a lot of clinical research. And as we were talking about clinical trials, we're like, yeah, it's adult only, it's adult only. I mean, we love our adult mitochondrial patients too, but I'm really excited that we're making some moves on trying to come up with a meaningful study, meaningful clinical outcomes to really look at pediatric populations. And then also looking for, we're one of the centers for the CHOP-led Lee syndrome natural history study, where we're really, we need to do this to look at natural history before we decide on what would be the primary, secondary outcomes for a clinical trial, and one that would be set up for success. So I'm excited for any upcoming pediatric trials. And then, things on the horizon I'm really excited about is I'm also a neuroimmunologist. I did 2 fellowships. And so there's a lot of talk about, and I think somebody mentioned about, immunological dysfunction and mitochondrial disease. So I think that's an untapped still area of research and potential area of therapeutics. So I'm excited for upcoming work in that area as well.
Well, thank you so much, Dr. Yang. And last but not least, Dr. Sinedo.
Oh, me. So I think most of us who are child neurologists are eternal optimists as well, or we would have been dermatologists and just treated acne. But that's just an inside joke for us neurologists. But I think the biggest thing that happened to me this past year is we've been working with the adult stroke people, and we have a study looking at MCA1, which is just a big artery in the brain that gets clogged and causes ischemic stroke. And what Dr. Walker has been able to show and prove is we have outcome data for this type of stroke. We have Rankin scales. That means how you recover in rehab. What we can do is we can take a piece of muscle at the beginning when they show up to the hospital in acute stroke. And what we do is we take a little bit out of their muscle, so they get a 2-for-1. And we take it immediately to lab. We isolate their own mitochondria, and we give it back to the patient along with the roto-rooter job of sucking out the clot. And we find that these patients have a much better outcome with giving their, we call it autologous mitochondria, back to them to decrease the penumbra area. And what this has shown us is that you don't have to take hemopoietic cells and transfer mitochondria into those cells and give that back to the patient. We can actually give the patient's own free mitochondria that we isolate from muscle back to the patient, and we can get improvement in stroke. So this opens up a whole lot of other ideas about how we can possibly treat mitochondrial diseases. It's also been done in the heart. Macaulay at Boston Children's has used the patient's own muscle cells, which are normal, and give it to failing heart cells. So I think it's a field that will grow, and I think hopefully we'll be able to tap into that for further treatment of mitochondrial disease per se. So we'll just have to see how it all pans out, but that's exciting to me.
Well, thank you so much, Dr. Sinedo. I want to draw everyone's attention to their screen and to talk a little bit about our very special Ask the Mito Doc webcast series that will be occurring next month. We're going to be demystifying what is primary mitochondrial myopathy. And this is going to be a little bit different. Again, it is a disease-specific Ask the Mito Doc, and it will be held at 12 noon Eastern Time. Looking forward to February, we have a much requested Ask the Mito Doc about ICU and anesthesia and mitochondrial disease. We'll have our very own Dr. Goldstein there with Dr. Todd Kilbaugh, who's also from the Children's Hospital of Philadelphia. So looking forward to that. I want to thank all of our speakers. And if I could give you a big round of applause all by myself, I would, because you've done a great job today. We went over and it was worth it to just hear your answers. Thank you for all you do for the Mito community, and for all online and watching. I hope you have a wonderful holiday season, and we will see you again in January. So thanks again, everyone. And